Scottsdale Christian Church over the years, you know that I began a habit several years ago of doing a State of the Church sermon. About this time each year, it just seemed good to look back on the things that we had done as a church and then look forward to some goals, some things we'd like to do. And again, there's definitely value in that, but as I looked at it last year this time, the first of the year for us here at Transforming Life, I realized that there's also a problem, that the same problem that I see in a lot of ways with the state of the church is a problem with the State of the Church sermon. It focuses on what we do instead of who we are. It focuses on doing instead of being. And so I began what I anticipate to be a tradition of doing a sermon this time each year on our core values. Let's look at what God wants us to be, because if we be the right things, then we will do the right things. What we do comes out of who we are. Doing comes out of being. And so that's where we're going to focus. These core values, there are foundational and essential principles for living. So that just tells you, if I truly live out these principles, live by these principles, it will affect what I do. Well, I went back, because my notes are often very sparse, and so I went back and watched last year's sermon just to okay, any good things I need to make sure I get in there, and there weren't any at all. One thing I did realize is I did a lot of talking, and it doesn't, it's not like one Bible text that you get engaged and follow through on. And so I decided that this year would be a little more Socratic. Are you familiar with the Socratic method? I ask questions and you answer, which the goal is for us to know these things. And so that's what we're going to do today. And I guess the first thing to start off on, we'll test your memory in this sense. Do you remember how many core values I listed last? I won't even begin to ask if you know what they are, unless you've got your notes from last year and you're looking back there. Who knows how many, which even that's valuable, if you've got notes from last year and can find them?
3.
Well, there's 3 today, so that's going to get you started through today. There are total, what's a good religious number? 7. There you go. And, things seem to work out that way, and I sort of help them at times, but 7 core values. But yeah, the other thing I noticed is the sermon last year was, plenty long enough. And if we do this back and forth, it'd be longer. So I'm going to break them up. And there really is a natural division point, as we'll see today. There's a progression among all of these core values. And again, a transition, a division point. So the ones we're looking at today are even more core. These are the core of the core, the foundational core values. And the first core value, what do you think it is? Worship. There you go. And hopefully we've been seeing that that makes sense. It's been an emphasis since we started in Matthew and as we've continued along. I raise this question sometimes, and I've asked you, what is life's most important question? What is the question that people and philosophers have grappled with throughout the ages? What's life about? What's the meaning of life, the purpose of life, or sometimes just the one-word question? Why? Yeah. Why? Well, what does the Bible say in answer to this? What is the meaning, the purpose of life? Why are we here? Psalm 95, 6-7 says, "Come, let us bow down in worship. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker. For He is our God, and we are the people of His pasture, the flock under His care." You look at that verse, and in and of itself, it definitely needs to be fleshed out, but it gives you the basic there of the meaning of life. It's this relationship between God and us. That's why He created, and that's why He's done everything He's done since, is to have this relationship with us. And in a relationship, there's roles, there's things that you do, and it's the same with God and us. And you've probably seen, if you've been around for any length of time, you've seen this diagram I have with God at the top and us at the bottom, and those arrows going from us to God and God to us. Well, what goes in that? What's our part of this relationship toward God? Worship, yeah. Our part is to worship God. And if it was anyone other than God, we'd think, well, that's a little narcissistic, If you're in a relationship with anyone else and they tell you your part in the relationship is to worship them, you probably want to stay away from that person in that relationship. But God, yeah, there we go. But God, it does fit. It's appropriate for us to worship God because He's God and we're not. Our part in the relationship is to worship Him, and His part is to, what do you get from the rest of that verse there? If you were to take a word right from that verse, it's a noun and it'd be more a verb. Bless is the word I usually use. The flock under His care. God cares for us. He blesses us. And that word always needs a big asterisk to define it, because people today, God's going to bless me. Well, here's my blessing list, God. It's like the Christmas list I made, only bigger, because you're God. The people I made the list for, they're only people. Hey, I'm going all out here. But blessing, again, needs that definition. We're under God's care. He knows what's best. He's going to do that. And there is this cycle that as we worship God, that's how we experience His blessings. And it's not God up in heaven saying, well, I'm mad at you if you don't, and you're not getting anything from me. It's just the nature of the world. If you put good gas in your car and you take care of it and give it oil changes, it blesses you with running well. It's not your car saying, I didn't like the fact you didn't give me oil, I've just refused to go. It's just its nature. It's going to refuse eventually if you don't do the things. Well, the nature of our relationship to God is we worship Him, and that results in the life of Him working in our lives in ways that you could call being blessed, being cared for. And this idea, it's apparently been around for a long time. The Westminster Shorter Catechism, which was a style of teaching, it's somewhat like today. Ask a question and the person answers, and it's how they would learn things. From 1646 or 47 says, man's chief end, his purpose in life, is to glorify God, which is a synonym for worship, and enjoy Him forever. So you have those two sides. We glorify God, and then we enjoy His blessing, His presence in our lives, His care. Well, the irony is, and I'm reluctant in some sense to say this, but I think you can definitely see it. The irony I see today is many attempts to glorify and focus on God, they actually focus on us and our attempts. I've said before, people were to leave a worship service, and you go around to a lot of churches today. People, how was the worship service? Oh, it was great, and ask them why. I think the things they list off are going to be very human focused. This was great, and they're all going to be the things people did versus someone coming out and saying, I just saw how wonderful. I realized I've come to know even more how wonderful God is, how awesome God is. I don't know that happens. And again, it's well-intentioned. There truly are efforts to worship, to glorify, to focus on God. But there's more attention on our efforts than on God from those things. Our attempts to glorify God, well, they bring glory to us if they work. And if they don't, if someone walked out, it was bad. Why was it bad? Well, same thing. You'd list off these, this person didn't do this well, this well, this well. And I tell you, as we come out of here, I hope, I appreciate comments I get at times about the sermons, but I hope when we come out of here, it's what I'm pointing to in the Word of God that is the reason that says, this was a great time together. Because I see something there in God's Word. I see something about God. Wow, He's awesome. And here's what I need to do to live that out in my life. That's the goal. Think about it. Why would we focus on us? You have two possibilities here. We have God and us. Why would we ever focus on us? Why would we do that? And I think the only answer is we're unaware of God. To even begin to focus on me versus God means I must not really know about this God guy, or I wouldn't do it. And I compare it at times to a smartphone. It's like we know God's God. We know He's big and powerful and smart and stuff. But it's a little bit like I know my phone. I know it does a lot of things. As a matter of fact, I know it does way more things than I'm using it for. I use mine for probably on a percentage more than some, but definitely not as... I hear these things. I saw a commercial the other day for Samsung Pay. And it was interesting because even the merchants in this commercial, guys like, I want to pay with my phone. We can't do that. You're like, yeah, you can. And he just holds it up next to the little red, and they're like, wow, it does that? I feel like that's how we are. Like, wow, God's like that? I didn't know. And there's no reason we would focus on me instead of Him unless I don't really know what He's like. And so the solution then is what? To know God more, which is a name for worship. That's really what worship is. It's coming to know who God is. There's both sides of it. I have to know who He is to do worshipful things. I mean, worship is an expression of, wow, God, you're awesome. Because of that, I'm going to do this. That's why singing is worship. Reading the Word is worship. Giving is worship. All those are acts of worship. But why do we do them? Because God is worthy of them, which goes into what this word is and how we worship God. How do we worship God? Psalm 29:2 says, "Honor the Lord by giving Him the glory He deserves. Worship the Lord in the splendor of His holiness." Now, we've talked about before, Hebrew poetry is called parallelism. They don't say Jack and Jill went down a hill and try to rhyme, the last word of each line. They say a similar idea in two different ways. So, the parallelism, I think you can see it. Honor the Lord by giving Him the glory He deserves. Worship the Lord in the splendor of His holiness. What's parallel in those two verses? That one verse, those phrases. Honor and worship. And you take the whole phrase really. Honor the Lord by giving Him the glory He deserves. Worship the Lord. Worshipping the Lord is the same as honoring the Lord. By giving Him the glory He deserves in the splendor of His holiness. You see the parallelness there. So worship equals honor. By giving God the glory He deserves. Glory is adoring praise. And it's one of those things, again, God has glory and we give Him glory. We give Him this adoring praise based on His attributes, who He is. You give Him, it says, the glory He deserves. Well, think about that idea. How much glory does God deserve? It's like we put like prices on things. If I were to try to sell you a pack of gum for $500, I'm guessing I wouldn't get any takers. But if I were selling a new TV for $500, that'd be about right. If I was selling a new car for $500, like, okay, I'm right on it. You see, you correlate a price, something, the value it deserves. Well, this is talking about give God the glory He deserves. And it goes back to how much glory does God deserve? All of it, yeah, as much as we can give. There is no limit to the glory God deserves. He's all gloriful, all deserving of glory. And that's what this word worship ties into. You remember the old pronunciation of worship? Worthship, yeah. And really the old English was weorthship, W-E-O-R or something. But it's that idea. It's worthship. It's declaring the worth of God. That's what worship is. Well, for that, you need two things. There's two aspects. First of all, you have to give Him the glory. You have to declare His worth in word and deed. So it's not just, God, you're awesome, you're incredible, you're so worthy, but I live like it. Well, to give God the glory, to live it out, to say it, I have to, first of all, believe it, which means I have to know about it. Yeah. If you didn't know what a piece of gum was, and I said, here, you want a pack of gum? You want a pack of gum for $500? Well, maybe. I've never heard of this gum. Is it worth $500? Well, God, to even begin to give Him the glory He deserves, I have to know. I have to be aware of His glory. And the word that way, it means the resplendent beauty and magnificence of God. To give Him that glory. The noun of, what I give, it's that idea of adoring praise. But God's glory is this resplendent beauty or magnificence. So the splendor of God, the brightly shining glory of God. That's what resplendent means. Well, how do I come to know how much glory God deserves? How much glory He's worth? Get to know Him, exactly. And how do I get to know God? The Bible is one. Life experiences and relationships. Yeah, as I talk with others and see what He's done in their life. Here's what He's done in my life. I talk with them and I share. We talk about that, and it's all grounded on the Bible. That's how I get to know God. And in the midst of all of it is my prayer life. It's working through all that. The Holy Spirit that's working through all that. Someone should put that together and make like a growth triangle. And what do I need to be aware of? Look what it says. The splendor of His holiness. What's God's holiness? This is like a bonus question. This one's a little tougher.
It's like how different He is from us in the perfect sense.
There's two senses. How different He is. Holy means separate, cut off, cut apart. And in God, He's holy in two ways. First of all, He's perfect sinlessly. That's ethical holiness. God doesn't sin, we do. But then He's also, and the big word here would be ontologically holy, which means he's different than us. He's different stuff. He's not just a stronger me. You know, you could take people and you'd have, least strong, less, all these, you could line them up. But they're all people. It's just this guy's stronger than this guy. This guy's smarter than this guy. Well, God's not like anywhere like, oh, he's way over. No, he's totally different. It's a different category with God. He's ontologically, his very being is different. He's the creator. No one else can create out of nothing. He's the sustainer. No one else can do that. The redeemer. No one else could do that. God is holy in that sense. And those are the things that are so awesome about him. So what's it look like to worship God? That's our first core value is worship. All right, what's it look like? I would say three things. First of all, it's a focus on God versus a focus on me, myself. If God is so incredible, if God is God and I'm not, if he's so awesome, if he's so worthy, my focus should be on him, not me. And I thought about what's even that, keep digging deeper. What's that look like? What's that look like? Well, what's one thing that looks like? If my focus is truly on God versus me, what's one action that's going to result from that? Humility is definitely a trait and attitude. Yeah, God's God, I'm not. What's one thing I'm going to do? If I'm truly, I need to focus on God more. Worship. Give him control. How do we see God? We said before, what was your answer just a minute ago? In the Bible. Yeah, if I'm truly going to focus on God, don't I need to spend some time focusing on God? I mean, I want to focus on him with an attitude of humility, and this idea of focusing on God, it's going to be this worshipful God, you're worth this. But just to do it means I got to look at him. I got to get in the Word. And what keeps us from getting in the Word? Who are we focused on? Chances are it's me, yeah. I mean, we could say, I work so much and do so, but, and I love what was in the Francis Chan sermon, I forget who he was quoting, but he said, one of the many uses of Facebook will be to show that we really did have time to do other things. Yeah. He's like, I'm so busy, I can just never get to this. Okay. How much time you spend on Facebook? Or other things like that. We have time to spend some time focused on God. And so that's part of it. If I truly think God is worth so much, we got to spend some time focused on him versus me and things I might like to do. Put God first versus myself. This is the idea of surrender. God, if you're God, I need to put you first. And I need to trust that is truly the best way to live life. That is how I'm going to be blessed. And maybe not in the way I would like to define blessed, but in the true meaning of blessed. If I truly put you first, surrender to you and your will, that is best. And then another element of worship I see is to rely on God versus ourselves. Again, he's God and I'm not. Why would I ever approach any situation and think, all right, I'm going to take the lead in this. It's all going to be on me. I can do this. Even if I think, God's prepared me. No, I need to rely on him. And that sometimes, again, we can't go to the opposite extreme. Like, I'm just going to sit around and do nothing. God, will you take care of this? Call me when you're done. But the other extreme is, I just take it all on myself. And I don't rely on him, his principles, and his power. And the result is, if I rely on God when things work out, then God gets the glory. If it's all me and everything I do, then look what I did. Thanks, God, but I'm really thanking God for me. Sort of that messed up idea we have of trying to focus on him. And so our first core value is worship. The second core value, what do you think it is? What do you think it is?
Discipleship.
Grace. Grace. Discipleship's coming down the list. But we try to see things that as we build in more fundamental and more core. And even then, as you would think about it, because you know me, I love talking about grace. But I put worship first. Why should worship come before grace?
Well, because God offers grace. It comes from God. It comes from God, so how can you know who it's coming from if you don't know him first?
Definitely that element of, worship's about God. Grace is something God does. Has Grace always been around? Not this Grace. It's so tough with you in the room, Grace. But the same answer would apply. Has Grace always been around? No. No, grace didn't always exist because there wasn't a need for grace. So in that sense, grace is secondary. Worship, there's always, once there was a people, the very second there was people, worship was appropriate. But grace didn't come into play until there was sin. There was nothing to show grace toward. So, yeah, that's why worship comes first. But grace is definitely right on the heels of that as we think about God, because, biblically speaking, how far into the Bible are you before the sin appears? Chapter 3. Doesn't take long for the need for grace to be there. But as we think about grace, then we always talk about amazing grace, and, we sang that song, a version of it. Well, we need to know why it's so amazing. One of the things I'm seeing as I get ready for our series in Ephesians, Paul is saying, listen, to live this Christian life, you need to know just how incredible it is, what you've been saved to and what you've been saved from and how you've been saved. You can't live it if you don't know it. Well, same thing. We're to live this life by grace. We've got to know about grace. God created us because He loved. I mean, that's the whole reason. God wasn't obligated, wasn't like, bored. Now, He wanted this relationship because He loved us. Well, then we went and did the very opposite of the things He said to do. We sinned, Adam and Eve, but each one of us has followed in their footsteps. We broke the relationship. Why does sin break the relationship with God? Going back to one of those traits of God? Because He's holy. And that's His ethical holiness. He not only can't sin, He can't have anything to do with it, and He can't leave it unpunished. You just can't ignore it. Like, I'll pretend I didn't see that. You wouldn't say it's a good person who saw an adult beating a child. Like, well, at least I'm not beating the child. I'll just pretend I didn't see that. You wouldn't say that's a good person. No. God, He's holy. He has to punish sin. Well, what was God's immediate response to sin?
I'll fix it.
I'll fix this. What verse do you find that in? Genesis 3:15, by the way. Yeah, God says, I'm going to take care of this. And it might not look at it at first because Satan will bruise the heel of the one I send to take care of it, but he will crush Satan's head. Trust me on this. I'm going to take care of this. And the entire rest of the Old Testament is God working toward that, working it out. It's all about grace. That's when grace comes into play. And what are some definitions of grace that I've given? I'll give the ones that are so-so and see if you know the one that I like the best. There's always unmerited favor, something you get you don't deserve. There's grace, God's riches at Christ's expense. Those are some of the ones that, they're okay. But what I think is the best definition? Do you remember that one? Because it's both sides of it. It's not just unmerited favor. Unmerited favor is the boy walks by your house, remember, and you give him a candy bar for doing nothing. Yeah, favor bestowed, so it rhymes, when wrath is owed. The boy walking by your house throws a rock through your window. He throws the whole window. This is a strong boy. Not God strong, but strong. He throws a rock through your window, so he not only doesn't deserve, it doesn't deserve anything, he deserves something bad, and you give him the candy bar. And, and any illustration has its weak points and stuff, and there's elements of God. He doesn't just say, hey, no big deal. But God gives us this chance to restore our relationship, even though we don't deserve it at all. That's grace. And, grace is twofold, and it corresponds to the twofold effects of sin. What are those?
More sin?
Well, more sin, that would be the second effect of sinfulness. Sin makes us guilty, and sin makes us sinful. We sin more. And then, so grace takes care of both of those. And what are the two ways that the grace takes care of the problems of sin? What's the cure for guilt? That's how we do it. What does God do? Forgiveness, yeah. God forgives us. And what's the cure then for sinfulness? Well, the forgiveness cures the guilt. Jesus. And what's the process of becoming less sinful? Sanctification, that'd be the big word. Yeah, great. Yeah, the big word for the cure for guilt is justification. The big word for the cure for sinfulness is sanctification. Or you could just use, growth, maturity, transformation is the word that I often use. And they're both problems. It's both part of that. When it says in Ephesians, for it is by grace you have been saved, so many people think, oh, that means my sins are forgiven, justification, and I get to go to heaven, glorification, and it doesn't apply to anything in between. I'm just sort of waiting now. Yep. Been forgiven, going to heaven. But saved also applies to that whole big chunk. Hopefully a big chunk, I guess, but between the time I'm forgiven and when I die. That's all to be spent in sanctification, in becoming more and more and more like Christ, conforming to His image, being transformed into His image. And what does it look like? What's it look like? Well, first of all, relying on God's grace versus our efforts. If I'm truly instilling and living out this core value, if I say grace is important, that means I rely on grace, not my efforts. I don't think, how am I saved? Well, because I'm a pretty good person. I live a pretty good life. I'm a little more secure today because I said my prayer, and yesterday I didn't say my prayer. Boy, if Jesus would have come back yesterday, it'd been a close call. No, that's not living out grace. That's, saying, we say grace is important, but if we live that way, and it's tough sometimes, and Satan is going to try to make it tougher. He wants us to be confused about grace because grace is so incredible. Again, it shows how incredible God is. Really, God? This is the deal? You're saving me not based on how good I am? No way. That's nowhere to be found in the world. One thing we saw at this conference. You don't find grace in other world religions. You do not find grace. It's all about works. Christianity is the only religion that has grace, certainly as Judaism is now. In the essence, truly, of the Old Testament, there was grace. But you ask someone now who's a Jew how you're saved, they'll give you a works explanation. So it's all that way. We said, they talked about Muslims yesterday, and they basically said, you have two angels following you. One records your good deeds and one records your bad deeds. I don't know which one you're keeping busier lately, but and then at the end, at judgment, what they do is they take all these things they've recorded and they put them on scales. And if you're 51% or more good, you get to go to heaven. If you're 51% or more bad, you go to hell. That's salvation in Islam. So that's entirely works. Christianity is the only place you find grace. Well, it's one thing to have it, like, wow, we've got grace on our side. What do you guys got? But you got to live it. You got to live it. And again, certainly when it comes to forgiveness of my guilt and going to heaven, but also as it comes, and this is one thing that people even who get the first one struggle with, to live more and more like God, to transform, to be changed. That's grace too. It's not, okay, God forgave me freely, now I've got to work hard to get better. It is just as much by grace, which means we have just as little chance of becoming better on our own and working at it as we do of being forgiven on our own and working at it. No way I'm getting into heaven on my own efforts. Well, don't think I can grow and mature entirely on my own efforts. And through focusing on what to do versus how, and more importantly, why. So I rely on God's grace, which means, again, not just in word, I truly live out. And then I show grace to other people. If grace is so important, the other side of it is I don't just live by it, I show it to you. The God of the universe has shown it to me when I totally didn't deserve it. You know what? You may not deserve it for me. That's the essence of grace. If you did something and deserved something good for me, it wouldn't be grace. It'd be reciprocation. You did something good, I do something good. But when you do something and you don't deserve something good, and I give you something good, that's me living out the grace God's shown me. Tell you what, this idea comes up so much, unity. I'm seeing it again as we go through Ephesians. We saw it in James, we saw it in Matthew. It's huge in Romans. It's all over. Christians, there is no excuse to not be united with other Christians. Romans says, as far as it depends on you, do everything possible. You do not have a Christian brother or sister that you don't speak to if you haven't tried to work it out. There is no excuse whatsoever. The Bible emphasizes this so much, it's unreal. It's like, move on to something else, guys. They don't. It's just over and over and over. All these things about unity. The true Lord's Prayer. We think the Lord's Prayer is our Father in heaven. That's the model prayer. What's the true Lord's Prayer? What did He pray for? Yeah, let them be one, Father, as you and I are one. Let them be united. And that doesn't just mean, it's bad we have Baptists and Methodists and this and that. No, it's even worse when, again, Sue doesn't get along with Bob. That's bad. And so we have worship. You see how grace builds on that. God shows us grace, and that's one of the things that's so incredible about Him. And then the third core value, discipleship. You're going to be all ready for next week. Okay? First thing next week, Mark gets to answer the question. Just a little hint there. Faith. Yes, there we go. Ephesians 2:8. I read the first part, for it is by grace you have been saved through faith. They're intertwined there. God's part is grace. Our part is faith. God shows grace. I have faith in it. You have been saved by grace through faith, by God's grace through your faith. Now, does that mean faith earns salvation, right? That's how it's not saying prayers, it's not giving money, but faith. That's how I earn salvation. No, Paul says, listen, in case you don't get this, don't let me confuse you. The full passage there, going into verse 9, for it is by grace you have been saved through faith, and this, not from yourselves, it is the gift of God, not by works that no one may boast. Now, here's just a little deeper theological lesson. The thing that's not from yourselves is not the faith. Some people, parts of religion will tell you, God gives you the faith, you can't have it on your own, you have nothing to do with choosing your own salvation. No, it's the whole process. It's not me that said, hey God, if you show me grace, I'll have faith. Will we be good then? I didn't come up with this idea. I couldn't come up with this idea because, as a professor of mine used to say, we didn't have the plan and we didn't have the man. If I came up with an idea, God, if you'll forgive sin somehow, and make it available through grace, I'll have faith. I couldn't come up with, okay, I've got the guy who's going to forgive sins. No, everything's God. It is from God. The whole plan, the whole idea of I'll show you grace, I'll forgive sins through my own death, the death of my Son on the cross, paying for everyone's sins, and you can receive that forgiveness and salvation in general, the transformation through faith. That's from God, not from us. That's what it means. This not from yourselves. It is the gift of God, the whole thing. Not by works so that no one can boast. So our faith isn't a work. Our faith doesn't earn salvation. There's two ways to heaven. You've always heard there's one way to heaven, right? There's actually two ways to get into heaven? Yeah, the first one is to be perfect. So, anyone want to try for that one? You want to apply under that plan? Because we're born under that plan, and if you would die before you reach an age where you sinned, you would get into heaven on the be perfect plan. Stand before God and say, why should I let you in? Like, I never sinned. You're God. We got nothing wrong. Our relationship was never broken. But the plan B for most of us is grace. It's faith. God's offer, His gracious offer, my faith in accepting that offer, that's the other way to get into heaven that, everyone in the room is in need of. So that's where we are there. Faith is the opposite of works. And so as we think about faith, and here's the thing, it's one of these core values that sort of has a double meaning. It's the opposite of works, but faith is also the opposite of something else. You remember? Sight, exactly. So you've got that side of things too. 2 Corinthians 5:7 says we live by faith, not by its opposite, not by sight. And so you think about it, faith versus works, that's the response to worship. That's the response to grace. God has offered salvation. Tell me what you could do to earn it. What could you do to earn the Son of God dying for you? How many prayers do you think you'd need to pray for? God says, yeah, that was worth my son dying. How much money would you have to give? And God would say, okay, that paid for it. Yeah, there's nothing you could do. Faith versus works is a response to grace. God, there's no work that could ever even come close. The only way I can receive grace is through faith. Faith versus sight is the response to worship. Okay, I'm approaching this situation. I can rely on me and what I see, what I've got, all my resources I've got to bring to bear in this situation, my intelligence, my wisdom, my strength, my influence. Or God, I can trust in you. Now let me see, my worship shows you're God and I'm not. You're all powerful, I'm not. You're all I think I'm going with you, God. Faith versus sight is a response to worship. Faith versus works is a response to grace. Faith versus sight is a response to worship. And the key part of this, if we're truly trusting in God, if we're walking by faith, not by sight, is prayer. We can't say we are walking by faith and not pray. It's the absolute essential. And as I went over this, I realized it was this same Sunday that we had a picnic that I did the core value sermon last year because I used the illustration of Lisa's beans. She's known for her baked beans. And I don't like baked beans, so I don't really have a point of comparison, but everyone says her baked beans are so amazing. She got the recipe from a relative, and they're like so amazing. And I asked her, what's unique about those? And she said, well, the brown sugar is different than some, the amount of bacon, the copious amount of bacon, apparently. And so you've got all these things, and it's not, they wouldn't be Lisa's baked beans without sugar or bacon, but you know what? They wouldn't be baked beans at all without beans. That's what prayer is. Prayer isn't like a little salt that, it'd be nice to have. Prayer isn't that unique ingredient that makes them Lisa's versus someone else's. Prayer is the beans of baked beans. You cannot have faith if you're not praying. Because you're saying, God, I'm trusting in you, but that's what prayer is. It's a declaration of dependence on God. God, I'm depending on you. That's what our prayer is. God, I'm coming to know you more and more in that prayer, worship your grace, all of that. We're not truly living by faith, definitely versus sight, if we're not praying. And then also, we make it clear as we talk about faith, faith is more than belief. Remember the definition or the thought, what is belief?
Intellectual assent.
Yeah, intellectual assent. I agree in my mind something is true. A statement is true. There is a God. I agree with that. I've looked at the evidence, can't prove it. That's the whole faith, belief aspect. I believe it versus I know it, but I believe mentally that's true. And faith then is, what's faith add to the mix? What's the next step? I believe it, therefore I live it, yeah, as expressed in, and that's the thing where faith, certainly it's not the same as living it, because faith, that would be the works, but that's why James says you can't have true faith without works. I commit to it, I rely on it, and I surrender to it. I believe there's a God, therefore I have faith in God. I commit to Him, I rely on Him, I surrender to Him, and because of that I will live it. That's what James says. You don't have true faith if you're not living it. True faith will absolutely result. Or one's missing. You either don't truly believe it or you're not really committed to it. Or else you would do it. So belief is intellectual assent. Faith is that reliance and surrender. Faith follows from belief. Faith is, again, I'd say about the same as commitment. Because of what I believe, I commit to it. I love the Indiana Jones. I believe there's something there. I'm committing. Taking that step. If it's not there, I'm going down this trench. I'm committing to it. Relying on it. So our core values, again, they're foundational and essential, but I'll admit they're a little hard to remember. There's 7 of them. It's not that, if we can't remember 7 things, we're probably in trouble. But, I came up with a little, they call it acrostic last year, and I didn't remember it till I saw it again. We go forth, worship, grace, faith. You'll find out the next part last week, I guess. Mark knows what the first answer is. D. Doing. We go forth doing. But there are some things that if you take this, our purpose statement is meant to encompass all of these, and hopefully we can remember our purpose statement. It's 2 short sentences. The first one is, our purpose is to worship God. Yeah. There's 2 things that, as a church, our purpose statement is to worship God is the first one. Next week we'll see the second one. And worship, if you think about it, it's to think and act in ways that realize and show God's ultimate worth in our lives. It's to think, this is how I view life, in light of the fact God's God and I'm not. He's worth everything. And then I act accordingly. That's what the worship is. And again, if you think about that, well, that applies to grace and faith. God is God. He's the only one that can save me. I'm going to live by that grace that relies on Him. And by the way, I'm going to show it to others because He was so nice to show it to me. It applies to faith. God, I see how incredible you are, how awesome you are, how all-powerful, all-knowing. I'm going to trust in you versus me. I'm pretty good. I'm a smart guy. Not in your league. I'm going to trust in you. I'm going to have faith. For my salvation, for the trials I face in life, I'm going to trust you. And so worship God really encompasses those 3, all 3 of them, the worship, the grace, and the faith. And the same thing next week. Our second purpose encompasses those second set of 4. And so I hope this, again, begins to really get in there, that if we can live out these things, and that's really the start to live it out. If I don't live these things out, there's a sense that, remember what James said about wisdom? If you don't truly live out wisdom, you don't have wisdom. You can know 2 + 2 is 4, and you don't have to use that, think about it every second. But if you aren't living out wisdom, you aren't truly wise. You can't say, I'm wise, and then never live it out, never follow wise principles. Well, it's the same thing with our core values. They're not really core, they're not really valuable if I'm not living them out. They're like, again, there's some things on a sheet that Steve said and I wrote down. But they're not my core values if I'm not living them out in my life. And so as we think about that, what needs to happen? How do we take these things from being words on a sheet to living them out? And maybe there's one of them, worship, grace, faith. What can you think? What comes to mind? This is what comes from me. This is what I need to start doing. I need to stop doing. I need to do better to live out either worship or grace or faith.